in Revelations, so you may follow along in your bulletin or in your Bible. I'm going to summarize the first 9 verses of chapter 7. It gets into some other things there. These verses tell us about 4 angels standing in the 4 corners of the earth, blowing the winds back to delay destruction. Another angel comes from the east, carrying the seal of God, which is placed on his servant's forehead. The east symbolizes the source of blessing. The seal is a sign of God's protection from God's wrath. These seals numbered 144,000 and were distributed among the 12 tribes of Israel, each receiving 12,000. I'll begin reading at verse 9. After this, I saw a vast crowd, too great to count, from every nation and tribe and people and language, standing in the front of the throne and before the Lamb. They were clothed in white robes and held palm branches in their hands, and they were shouting with a great roar, "Salvation comes from our God, who sits on the throne, and from the Lamb." And all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders, the 4 living beings. And they fell before the throne with their faces to the ground and worshipped God. And they sang, "Amen, blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and strength belong to our God forever and ever. Amen." Then one of the 24 elders asked me, "Who are those who are clothed in white? Where did they come from?" And I said to him, "Sir, you are the one who knows." And then he said to me, "These are the ones who died in the great tribulation. They have washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb and made them white. That's why they stand in front of God's throne and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will give them shelter. They will never again be hungry or thirsty. They will never be scorched by the heat of the sun. For the Lamb on the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of life-giving water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." Isn't that beautiful? Let's continue with chapter 8, and Phyllis is going to join me as we do some things here. When the Lord broke the 7th seal on the scroll, there was silence throughout heaven for about half an hour. I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and they were given 7 trumpets. Then another angel with a gold incense burner came and stood at the altar, and a great amount of incense was given to him and mixed with the prayers of God's people as an offering on the gold altar before the throne. The smoke of the incense, mixed with the prayers of God's holy people, ascended up to God from the altar where the angel had poured them out. Then the angel filled the incense burner with fire from the altar and threw it down upon the earth, and thunder crashed, lightning flashed, and there was a terrible earthquake. Then the 7 angels with the 7 trumpets prepared to blow their mighty blast. The first angel blew his trumpet. And hail and fire mixed with blood were thrown down on the earth. 1/3 of the earth was set on fire. 1/3 of the trees were burned, and all the green grass was burned. Then the second angel blew his trumpet. And a great mountain of fire was thrown into the sea. 1/3 of the water in the sea became blood. 1/3 of all things living in the sea died, and 1/3 of all the ships on the sea were destroyed. Then the third angel blew his trumpet. And a great star fell from the sky, burning like a torch. It fell on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star was Bitterness. It made 1/3 of the water bitter, and many people died from drinking the bitter water. Then the fourth angel blew his trumpet. stars, and they became dark. And 1/3 of the day was dark, and also 1/3 of the night. Then I looked, and I heard a single eagle crying loudly as it flew through the air, "Terror, terror, terror to all who belong to this world, because of what will happen when the last 3 angels blow their trumpets." May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of the scripture.
Many of you know, have kind of an unusual family story, and one thing about my family story that you might know and might not know is that I never met my biological father until, and I still actually haven't technically met him, because I didn't get to go to San Diego a few years back when I would hope to. But one thing that I've learned since discovering my father is that I have a military history on both sides of my family. And turns out that I'm related to a guy named Rene Gagnon, who is one of 4 people who are immortalized now in bronze in this epic statue that you see, where these 4 soldiers were raising the flag after the successful and hard-won battle of Iwo Jima. I'm actually related to one of those 4 guys, and he's kind of a great uncle or something like that. And what happened in this side of my family history that I was really interested in was that these 4 guys who had raised the flag, they had a picture taken of them. And then when they went back to the States, they actually went around all around the country reenacting this photo. It was kind of like the old-timey version of a viral video or a viral photo for them to go and reenact this picture for other people to be able to take the picture. And then later on, they were turned into this bronze statue. And so eventually this iconic sculpture that we see, we think of in our minds, was born. And even though I'm a Quaker and I really believe strongly in peace and how God is calling us to be a people of peace who pursue that peace using peaceful means, it doesn't mean that I'm any kind of stranger to military history. I probably know just as much about military history as anybody that you might meet. And I'm also no stranger to things like bravery and sacrifice. And I'm no stranger to seeing the kinds of depth of relationships that people who have served in battle have forged together, who have fought together and bled together and lost friends together. And I wish that the church family was like that. And that we as a church would have the kind of depth of relationship that's forged in these kinds of hard-won battles that you see in these soldiers who have grown so close together because they participated in something bigger than themselves. Someone at Triumphant made a comment that the military offers 3 things to the world that the church also, at its best, should offer. It offers people service, sacrifice, and heroism. And it's my sincere hope that the church could have the kind of deep and enduring relationships that you see among military personnel who have served together, who have forged these kind of lifelong relationships that will forever see themselves as a band of brothers, or as Lori might add, a band of sisters, you know, people who are so close together. And when I think about the martyrs of the early church and those that they left behind, and I think that this same sort of bond existed, this bond that I would like to see. Obviously, I wouldn't want to go through severe persecution to necessarily get that kind of depth of relationship. There's a side product of that. These people in the early church had that. They were persecuted by people in empire and all these different people at the time. And it was a real sacrifice to be a Christian, to be a person who would take a stand, not to accommodate to the forces at work against them. The temptations to just be happy and go along and get along with empire. The temptation to just go along and get along with the pagan culture that they found themselves in. And often their act of bearing witness, just like many parts of the world, the Christians still do today bear witness to the point of bearing it with their last breath. You know, these surely weren't fair weather Christians that we see on the pages of the Church of Revelation. These were not the sort of people who thought about faith as something that was kind of a medium priority, you know, that you might kind of back burner for a while while you think about your career or you think about all these other things that are going on in their life. These were people who prioritized their faith, who sacrificed greatly for their faith, and who cost a lot, you know, who sacrificed a lot to be the church, to be a prophetic witness to the world. And these were celebrated, these martyrs were celebrated heroes in the early church. And it's ironic that the day that we celebrate veterans and the day that the church used to celebrate its martyrs is the same day, and that the one has eclipsed the other in prominence. And people like Antipas of Pergamum, who's mentioned in chapter 2, are martyrs in the book of Revelation. And I know that we're Protestants, you know, and that there's things about the Catholic Church, so to speak, that make us really profoundly uncomfortable. Things like, or we would criticize them for what we perceive to be praying to the saints. But there's something about this, the roots of this idea have their the roots in the kind of experience of a church who had lost people, who had died in this kind of lamb's war that they were fighting. And that they knew that they were with God somewhere, and that they were with God also, and that somehow the bond that they shared would cross over, that couldn't be divided even by death. And so they would talk to their friends that they had lost, just like we might talk at a graveside to a person that we love. You know? And I think it's here that we get to this division, this most gut-level division of the church. The division between those of us who are living right now, who are the church on the world, and those of us who have passed on and are with God, surrounded by the throne in heaven. Theologians have typically called this division the difference between the church militant and the church triumphant. And the church militant, that's us. We're the ones who are still here, still waging the Lamb's war, still fighting on, still struggling, still bearing witness, and at times suffering and sacrificing for the cause of Christ. And the church triumphant is this part of the great cloud of witnesses that has passed on, that is currently not alive here at work on earth, whether that's looks like someone like Abraham or Isaac or Jacob, or even my grandmother, right? That's in this part of the church triumphant, those who have been released from their fighting, to the victory of God. And here in Revelation, in the part that Donna summarized, we see the 144,000, a number of huge symbolic value. 12,000 of each, well, not each of the 12 tribes per se, but 12,000 of 12 tribes of Israel. And we see this great multitude of people gathered that no one can count, and they're gathered around worshiping the Lamb and serving God as he sits on the throne. And most people would argue that this 144,000 people represents the whole church, both Jewish and Gentile, not just the 12 tribes of Israel, but all of us that, as Paul argued in Romans, that have been grafted into the family of God like wild olive branches. And in case you're wondering, I don't know if you've ever heard this scripture brought into a debate about the salvation of Jewish people, but I have heard this scripture referenced as a way of saying that there's the Jewish people who God has set apart and saved that don't necessarily have not accepted Christ as his Savior, as their Savior. And then these are the ones that are going to be saved. And I don't think that is really the intention of this number. It's not set a number that limits as much as it's a number that expresses the fullness of the people of God. And I've also argued with Jehovah's Witnesses who've come to my door about this passage too, because they have very clear understanding of who this 144,000 is. And it's not what they think either. It's not this group of people who get to go stay on earth and the other people get to go to heaven, and some various other strange interpretations of this passage. I think the only way that we can really understand the imagery of this passage is to open our minds to the mixing of quite a few Old Testament metaphors, and to keep the lens of Old Testament holy war theology that, as troubling as it is for us, is all throughout the book of Revelation. And despite this imagery being turned on its head with the Lamb sitting on the throne, this is very much a war that is being described here, the Lamb's war. In the Great Tribulation that's mentioned here, there's a lot of different ways people could interpret that or what that would mean. But I think it's less a statement about different divisions of time as it is something that has its roots in the historic struggle of Israel, most notably the exile as described by people like Daniel and Ezekiel. And the church is now in a time of intense persecution. And it had the same sort of identity crisis that the people of the exile had. It was asking itself questions in the face of the difficulty of being the church and witnessing to the world. The questions like, should I go along with this cultural mold that the pagan empire is forcing on us? You know, because to stand and fight, so to speak, could be very costly. It could lead to marginalization and suffering and hardship. And I think there's definitely a sense that this tribulation points to something cosmic, to something greater, to something at the end of the age. I'm not trying to say it doesn't, but in the early church this would definitely be something that they would see in light of their own experience of suffering, of being a church that's persecuted in the world, and the current struggle that they face and the hope that is shown on the other side of it. And so in this passage, what we find more than just kind of this wordless, you should just go along with whatever God calls you to do and suffer and die, and that's it, to just go silently off into some kind of dark night. What we see here is echoes of things like Jericho, where God mightily removed a terrifying obstacle that was in the way of the people of God as they journeyed to the Promised Land. What we see is echoes of Jubilee, where we see this beautiful picture of debts forgiven and people walking in freedom. And we see the restoration being signaled in these 12 tribes that have been restored and signaled by the great blast of horn. We see echoes of things like Moses' struggle with the Egyptians and giving these powerful plagues to Egypt. And we see beyond that the Passover basically lived out again in a new way, where God's people trust in his provision, and where they're being formed and set apart and delivered from the wrath of God who's leveled against God's enemies. In the desert wanderings of the Israelites, we see the same sort of struggle, where after they were brought out of Egypt with a mighty right hand, they made their way around the tabernacle. They were arrayed in this kind of battle formation. The tabernacle would be sitting, and there would be 3 tribes on every side, arrayed in a battle formation. And this is what we see here. We see the church described as an army, described as this 144,000 fighting men, so to speak, ready to go out and fight the Lord's battle, sealed and protected by God. And this 144,000 is a beautiful picture of Israel restored on the other side of the old exile, where 10 of the tribes of Israel were essentially wiped off the face of the planet. And we see them marching out into battle, so to speak, just like in the tabernacle, with God in their midst, with God at the center of all that they're doing. We also see that this great multitude that has passed on and gone on the other side of that, and they're gathered around the throne of God, worshiping, and they're beyond the place that the suffering could reach them. They're beyond the place of fighting like we are in this time. And this 144,000 is sealed in God's protection, and they're sealed in order to serve him, in order to be kind of God's army in this place. And he wages his war, this great war of the Lamb. And the great multitude of every tribe and tongue and nation, they're gathered around the throne of God to serve him in the temple by worshiping and praying and praising to him. And they wear these robes that are washed in the blood of Christ, showing the righteousness of those who have come and sacrificed for God. And they're shepherded by the great Lamb at his throne. They have been preserved from their struggles. They have been sealed by God. They may have touched earthly pain and seen suffering and plowed through it and gone to the other side, but now they are only experiencing the throne of God and the presence of God, to know perfect peace. I think this is an inspiring promise that we all look forward to as Christians, to the day when we won't be the church militant anymore, where we will be the church triumphant. But what we don't see in this passage, with all this war imagery turned on its head, where we have, instead of the Lion of Judah, we have the Lamb on the throne. Instead of the army fighting for God, we have them waiting as God fights the battle. And so it's this kind of holy war that's going on, but it's a holy war that's waged by God. And as the trumpet sounds the battle, it's God who acts, not God's people who are out there causing destruction or doing anything. It's more like the Battle of Jericho, where God's feeble people kind of march around doing these crazy acts of obedience, trusting that God will bring about the victory. And the actions they have done leading up to this point, and these two chapters are really well connected together, it is mostly the action of praying, of raising their voices to God as they cry out in their suffering and asking God for their deliverance. And they have been waiting expectantly for God to give his answer and to give his final justice in the face of the struggles that they face. And they've been crying out just like the people of Egypt cried out long ago. And God has heard their cry, just like he used Moses to send to the people who were suffering in slavery. And so God will answer this prayer for deliverance from the cruelty of God's enemies. All through Revelation, we see the different people worshiping God. We see the elders. We see the four living creatures. We see all these different people worshiping God, and all these different beautiful songs that kind of break into the book of Revelation with these beautiful praises that have been turned into songs in our time. You know, worthy is the Lamb who was slain. It's this kind of poetic refrain that keeps breaking into the book of Revelation as the church is triumphant now, worshiping God, just like everybody else who's come along. The creatures worshiping God, the elders worshiping God. Now the church triumphant worshiping God. And then the most shocking thing happens ever. The seventh seal is broken. And suddenly all the worship in heaven stops. And it stops and it stays stopped. And a hush falls over creation as it awaits the first wave of God's battle. So the seventh seal is broken. And the war trumpets begin setting off these plagues, just like the plagues of Egypt. Angels with the trumpets begin to sound as just like the plagues of Egypt started. They started affecting nature. And there was this division between the earlier ones that were kind of, as God was continuing to raise people's attention, to the later ones where it got more personal, more terrible, so to speak, more hard to endure. And so these woes that come out with each trumpet blast are woes that are tearing through creation, tearing through the very threads of creation itself. And there is going to be a coming time when God is making all things new, and that's really the hope and the heart of the book of Revelation. But here is a time where we see some destruction. We see cataclysmic forces that make the plagues of Egypt look like small potatoes in the grand scheme of things. And as imagination capturing as this imagery of destruction is, what we see isn't necessarily something that's being expressed in a literal way. I'm not trying to say that these are literal historical events that will happen just as described, like a third of the earth is going to be ripped away, and people are still going to be on it afterwards, or the sun is going to be struck down from the sky. I mean, these are terrible, awesome things, but I think what's really being said here isn't necessarily literal kind of interpretation here. It's symbolic interpretation about God's anger being leveled at God's enemies, and leveled in such a way that it touches every corner of creation, every sphere of human realms where people go. It touches everything that people can see. There is no place in the entire created order that the anger of God at this point is not felt. The mountains and the sea and the sky, even the heavenly bodies that are out there and the planets, they feel this this plague striking them. And all these things are shaken to the core by the power of God. And you can feel free to disagree with my interpretation at this point. I know Revelation is a pretty hard book to interpret. And if you want to take this as a literal thing, then by all means do so. That's between you and God. But as I look at this passage, and as I try to get to the point where, how does this affect me? What I see is the church. I see this beautiful picture of the church. And the scholar John Howard Yoder said that he believed that exile was the natural state of the church. And I think that he's right about that, that there's something about the church where we're always struggling. We're always struggling with our Christian identity in the face of a world that seems to fight against us, that seems to disagree with us, that seems to be at war with us at times. And when we look at this church, this militant church in Revelation, and we see a fuller picture for how the church should be, how the church can be in the world and not of the world, and what that means. And for me, when I look at this beautiful picture of the church, that really speaks to me. You see the church in its full maturity, fully developed, fully battle-ready to be working with God, so to speak. And we see a church that has broken free of the cocoon of apathy and lethargy. We see a church that longs to see God's covenant restored, God's will fully done on earth as it is in heaven. And we see this picture of a church that's militant and mobilized and working with God to bring about God's plan of redemption in the world. And it's a picture of a church that keeps waging war in prayer, who knows its prayers matter, who knows that God hears the cries of the oppressed, and that God will answer back in God's timing, just as he did at Jericho, just as he did with Moses and people in Egypt. And it displays the sovereignty and power of God in a way that demonstrates what Jesus said when he said that the gates of hell cannot stand against the church. That the empire may cause lots of pain and suffering and misery now, but it can do nothing to affect our souls, so to speak. That there's something sealed in us that only God has control over. That they can take away our lives, kind of, but they can't take away our Christian freedom. And there's something here that I find profoundly attractive, this call to a church that bravely and earnestly longs to see God's coming justice, and has not lost hope that God will one day restore this broken mess of creation fully. And it paints a picture of a church that's trusting God to bring about his victory, not giving up as we're prone to do, or trying to get ahead of God by taking matters into our own hands, but waiting for God to act, waiting for God's trumpet that directs his battle to blast, waiting for God to show up and do the things that we want to see. And I think our text today calls us for a response, asking us the question, are we a people who are looking for the movement of God? Are we willing to pray aggressively in spite of all the evidence against us, all the things that stand against us, and wait for that evidence to change, to see God powerfully work in our situation, to keep to keep watching for God as he answers our prayers? Are we willing to be a part of what God is doing to bring salvation to the world? I aspire to be, like we see in this passage, the church militant, to be a member of that. A church who stands at the ready, waiting for the next trumpet blast of God to direct us to play our part in this great Lamb's War, this great drama that we've been invited to. I want to be a church that's waiting and watching and listening for God to act. And the church God is ultimately calling us to become is this picture of health, of being battle ready, of being disciplined and fully trained and on the move with God. It's a call to nonviolent witness, but nonetheless it's still a call to a kind of militancy. It's still a call to sacrifice. It's still a call to even heroism. And how do we understand our faith in those terms? We each face the same struggles that the church has faced in every age. We ask ourselves, should we go along with this cultural accommodation, or should we have bold witness in our lives? Every church of every age asks that. Are our lives to be wrapped around the plans and purposes of God, or our own plans and purposes? Do we want a low-stakes spirituality without any kind of risk? Or are we going to be daring to risk big things for God? But we also have more than just a choice in these things. We have more than just an obligation. We have a rich opportunity to be filled with the presence and power of God. We can join with what God is doing in the world. We can trust that God will shore us up and carry us along in this great experience of exile that we face. You know, and it is a great experience of exile. As the church, I watch every day the church slip a little bit in prominence in society, slip a little bit as something that people look to see the light of God at work in the world. You know, and we can look at the joy, at the future with joy and hope and peace. And then all these things will eclipse, as we see in the book of Revelation, whatever suffering it is that we're currently facing, whatever struggles we have, and ultimately we will know that the struggle is worth it, that God has sealed us and brought us free to the end. And the Lamb's war is a holy war. It's a holy war that's waged in peace, and it's waged in prayer, and God will bring about the victory. And the questions that I want to leave you with today as we go into our time of open worship is, do you really want to be a part of it? And if so, are you listening to God to discover what part that you are being called to play in this great drama, this great story of redemption, this great Lamb's war that we serve as witnesses, by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony? So as we go into this time, I want you to wrestle with that. What is it that you're signing on for here? Are you signing on for Sunday morning 9 to noon? Or are you signing on for battling in prayer, being a witness in the world, and reaching out with the love of Jesus and watching God restore creation?